Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you to Paul, Jenny, and the SAPEX team for allowing me this opportunity. My name is Henrico Swanepoel, and I'm the Business Area Manager for Gordian Logistics Expert South Africa. Today I will discuss activating MRO or spare part management, understanding the basics. I must say, I would much rather have had this presentation in person and live, allowing for a more interactive discussion. But feel free to raise your questions via the chat function, and I'll do my best to answer them afterwards. Before we start, I believe it is important to state why spare part management and service logistics forms part of SAPEX. Typically, spare part management forms part of the bigger asset management landscape, but it is under the control of the supply chain function in a majority of companies. In principle, spare part logistics and supply chain has a number of similarities to mainstream logistics. However, spare part management mainly differ due to its sporadic demand. We often find that companies have a very mature supply chain function for raw materials and final products. But when we look at the supply chain function for spare parts, it is very immature, and we see companies suffer from uncontrolled growth in working capital and poor availability. Hence our discussion on the basics today. As you're aware by now, the objective of this session is to discuss the spare part management basics that forms the foundation for a mature spare part management supply chain. I will start with a quick introduction of who Gordian is and what we believe a spare part management roadmap to success is, and then I will focus on the 4 basic principles of spare part management. Without further ado, let's jump in. First, a brief company introduction. Gordian is a Dutch-rooted consultant company founded more than 15 years ago, and we specialize in spare part management and optimization. We are proud to have a footprint in Europe, Southern and Central Africa, and we understand that asset maintenance inevitably result in spare part consumption, and that there exists a risk that frequent failures or lengthy downtimes will result in enormous production losses. We, however, strongly believe that downtime should never be the result of a shortage of spare parts. Of course, availability is not an independent KPI, and as such, Gordian's methodologies are based on the displayed balancing act between availability, in other words, having the right spares at the right time, and working capital, naturally being the cost or financial value of spares carried. It also comes with the operational cost of your supply chain function. And I believe you can intuitively understand that there exists a science between this balance. Hence, Gordian specialize in this and try and ensure and deliver this methodology for clients. Now, before we can look at the basic principles of spare part management, we need to define a maturity roadmap for spare part management. In other words, structuring our approach to spare part management. Gordian applies our methodology through a holistic approach. We believe spare part management is based on a 3-phase roadmap. And although the execution of these building blocks is not limited to a specific order, it is always advised that with a solid foundation, you have a better start in realizing and becoming best in class. A structured approach will therefore save you money and time. Once you have a solid foundation in place, which we will discuss today and is presented by the bottom layer of the roadmap, you can start to optimize. Optimization, demand modeling, forecasting, etc. all then allows you to become best in class. Now for today, I will focus on these four basic indicated principles: master data management, categorization and strategizing, basic demand management, and rationalizing your stocking parameters. Please note that basic financial principles, warehousing principles, and basic contracting principles undoubtedly forms part of the foundations of SPM. We just simply do not have enough time today, and I believe the typical audience member at SAPEX already has a very good basic understanding of these elements in supply chain. So let's dig in and start with the first of the four principles. The first principle being master data management. I'm willing to bet a free SAPEX 2021 ticket that the first thing that comes to your mind is how do you manage thousands and thousands of spare part records, ensuring each record is coded and described and has all its relevant information assigned to it. The constant struggle store personnel, artisans, and supply chain has been dealing with to correctly identify these spare parts is as old as the trade itself. Unclear descriptions and codes create a number of communication problems and leads to inefficiency in maintenance operations. It would be logical that to invest in proper master data management will be beneficial to all parties involved. To highlight some of these obvious benefits, proper master data management makes identification of parts easier, increasing the efficiency of maintenance and their operations. It also allows for errorless procurement and accurate and often cost-effective service delivery from suppliers. I believe you can understand the up and down communication and miscommunication that often happens because of missing or incorrect master data. Master data management also eliminates the duplication and enables accurate stock levels, thus preventing unnecessary and uncontrollable growth in your working capital. Now, if we talk about master data management, we have to understand what it really means and what do we really refer to. There is an often misperception of exactly what it entails. Gordian believes master data does not only refer to basic data such as part numbers and descriptions, but it actually includes your procurement, your repair, and your warehouse data. Understanding and defining preferred suppliers, lead times, reorder points, repair costs, and the physical size and constraints of the items all contribute to effective spare part management. Now, to summarize master data management, I want to present to you Gordian's advised structured approach. The saying goes that when you attempt a complex task, spend the majority of your time planning your execution and the result will be successful. The same goes for master data management. Firstly, ensure you understand where the issues are in your data and then set your desired standards. Gordian typically follows one of two methodologies when we look at naming conventions and coding conventions. The standard modifier dictionary or the United Nations Standard Products or Service Code. The preferred method often depends on a client's ERP and internal functionality or capability. Secondly, empowerment and training is critical for the continuity and sustainment of master data. Ensure your data administrators and for those companies that has a master data function, the individuals running or administrating that understands the importance of master data. And lastly, verify your data. The value of a good old stock take cannot be underestimated. You need to ensure that the data actually that is being reflected in your ERP is true and accurate to what is presented physically on your plant. Okay, our second principle is categorization and strategizing. Now again, I want you to think of the thousands and thousands of spares. Everybody knows there is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all approach in supply chain. But is it possible to identify categories that need similar management? When we look at the different perspectives on spare part management, maintenance, procurement, warehousing, etc., the common thread becomes clear. All the parties involved are indirectly searching for the how in their responsibilities. In other words, how do we manage this mammoth of a task? Spare part categorization is all about enabling the formulation of management strategies. In other words, describing how specific groups of spare parts are and should be managed. Let's start by looking at typical categories, or as we refer to them, assortments. Assortments can differ in many ways. Think of maintenance expectations, required working capital, storage conditions, etc. It should be apparent to you that, for example, the storage strategy of chemicals and PPE will definitely differ. The same goes, for example, for the procurement strategy of regular spares and rotables. Categorizing spares in assortments therefore allows us to differentiate unique and transparent strategies for each group, which in return allows for optimized availability and working capital. Now, there are several strategies to consider for spare part management. Categorization serves as an enabler for these strategies. Gordian typically advises two levels of categorization: a technical level and an inventory categorization level. A technical categorization is often logical. What do they say? If it looks like a rose and it smells like a rose, well, it probably is a rose. But the second grouping, the inventory categorization, is a bit more complex. Here we need to evaluate each spare part on a matrix, the matrix presented in the top right corner. We plot each part according to its demand frequency and its unit price. This allows us to determine fast movers, medium movers, slow movers, and non-movers. You can now imagine that, for example, the procurement strategy for a fast-moving regular spare, such as a bearing, will differ from a slow-moving critical spare, where the demand is maybe once or twice a year. Please take a moment to look at the table presented. This table indicates typical examples of different inventory, procurement, and stocking strategies for common assortments. As part of the foundations of spare part management, Gordian typically applies our strategy template to the assortment categories as seen here. However, when you start to optimize spare part management, it is critical that you uniquely design each strategy to fit your environment. I believe you can now appreciate the importance and often complexity of categorization and strategization. Our third basic principle is demand management. Now, although I believe there to be several engineers in the audience, myself being one, I'm confident to say that the typical supply chain practitioners, engineers included, do not pride themselves on their technical or mechanical knowledge of spares being used in maintenance activities. This reality, of course, leads to a number of relationship problems between supply chain and asset management. Furthermore, the fact that the ownership of spare part management often falls in this niemandsland does not help either. When we look at basic demand, we therefore want to focus on this relationship or marriage between asset management and supply chain. And similar to the relationship with my COVID mask, the parties need to endure the frustration of one another in order to receive the benefits or protect themselves. Supply chain needs to learn the importance of technical specifications and part criticality. Asset management needs to respect the procurement process and trust the demand forecasting, often a bit foreign to them. If we look at the typical activities in demand management, you can see that it enables a lot of optimization activities. And if we do not understand the basis, or if we can't agree on the basic principles, allowing these optimization becomes very difficult. So what do we want to understand from our demand? Firstly, how does spare requisitions originate? In other words, where does the demand come from, or what does the demand look like? Is it time years, or is everything needed yesterday, as often the case with maintenance? Are processes being followed? And are material reservations utilized in our ERPs? Do ERPs actually dictate these processes? Then secondly, can asset management clearly differentiate between the demand of different maintenance types? In other words, if we look at planned and unplanned maintenance, can we actually determine what is the spares demand coming from planned maintenance and what's the demand coming from unplanned maintenance? And then lastly, can we identify which spares are critical and to what extent? And if we talk about criticality of spares, it immediately touches on asset criticality. Gordian again wants to advise a structured approach in creating synergy between asset management and supply chain. From experience, I can tell you there is always change management involved in this basic principle. Take time to understand the demand characters and do not make assumptions. It is possible that your asset management function at your company might still struggle with defining asset care plans or bill of materials. If that is the case, in order to build that relationship, invest in this exercise and remember that it will benefit you as well in the long run. You can see that the steps illustrated in the slide starts with understanding asset management's world first, before we look at our own. We need to understand whether they can actually differentiate between the maintenance types and whether they can actually differentiate in the demand. And then we start looking at criticality. Again, first from a maintenance perspective, before we look at it from a supplier's perspective. Our last and fourth principle is rationalizing your stocking parameters. It may sound very complex and difficult, but in fact, it simply means applying a method-based or calculated approach to determine your stocking parameters and not a gut feel, as is often the case. Minimum and maximum levels and reorder points are often based on feeling, specifically the feeling of the maintenance engineers. It is then also the case that these parameters are only updated when shortages or when supply delays are experienced. Hence, stock levels just seem to go up. We advocate a more rationalized, call it a scientific approach. I believe the benefits with regard to the 3 KPIs should again be obvious to you. What might be a bit surprising is that Gordian states that it is possible to increase availability while simultaneously decreasing your working capital. As can be seen in the graph, in short, if your categorization and strategizing is done correctly and you understand your demand, it is now possible to calculate stocking parameters per category, allowing different strategies per assortment. Hence, different availability targets per assortment. Again, think of your fast movers and your slow movers, your regular spares versus your PPE and your chemicals. Once you set different availability targets for each of these groups, you can now afford to carry higher inventory levels for your fast, cheap moving items, while carrying less stock for your slow, expensive items. But when I say less, I do not necessarily mean offering up too much, and that's where your criticality assessment comes in. Due to the Pareto principle in the demand, the net effect then results in an overall higher availability and lower working capital. Once again, I want to advise a structured approach to calculating stocking parameters. Of course, Gordian has proven mathematical methodologies supporting our calculations, but in this case, the focus is much less on how, but more on the trust of a specific method being followed. It should be consistent and fact-based. In this slide, you can see that the stocking parameters for fast and medium movers can almost always be determined from statistical data and by means of statistical methods. But for slower non-movers, that is often not the case, and we need to base our decisions on a decision tree. Such a decision tree typically includes known demand characteristics, criticality information, and supplier information. The obvious trick is then to achieve your availability targets, again per assortment, while optimizing your working capital and operational cost. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this brings me to the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for your attendance today. We only looked at 4 basic principles on the bottom layer of the supply chain roadmap. But I invite all of you to contact me or Gordian directly if you want to learn more. If there's any further questions, please feel free to ask them now via the chat function, and I will do my best to answer them for you. Thank you very much.